So the presentation that I am giving today is Creating Black Worlds, Looking for New Realities in Gaming. And like I said, it's largely going to be talking about my book project, Gaming in Blackness. Sorry, not Gaming in Blackness, old title, Playing in Color, How Black Gamers Build Worlds. And it's largely a book that talks about how Black individuals are finding space within communities that are often read as anti-Black, and given dangers within the spaces. I think the process in which they make these worlds is absolutely fascinating. However, building within the ashes of the fire is something that is very common to Black life and the history within the US. Hush harbors have served as spaces for individuals to practice religious freedom and enjoy one another's companies during times of slavery. You have examples like barbershops, which individuals like Norris Vorse Nunley have given us in terms of barbershops working as a sort of newer form of hush harbor, where you can create safe spaces, get the best shape-ups, find the best advice in life, unless you go on a day where they're roasting people and you are that target of roast. That is not a fun day. Don't be that guy. Just get your hair cut and get out. And spaces like Black neighborhoods, the hood, as I'm colloquially referring to it right now, in terms of environments that have been neglected, but Black individuals still find the ability to create life, space, beauty, and consistently find homes and build culture into spaces that have essentially been left to die, but continue to thrive nonetheless. Within the world that we live in, one could argue that the world has been burning for a very, very long time. And despite these contained apocalypses and major and awful events within Black history, Black individuals have still been building new ideas and new worlds of thought consistently in ways that they can find their space and make a living no matter what the situation is. However, now with the introduction of the internet and the video games, we have now been given new worlds to explore. And as you can see within the stock footage there, these worlds are massive, they're huge, they're amazing for so many ways. But just like how in many cases we've experienced many real world fires, we are now dealing with the reality of many digital fires, in that representation in these games are often lackluster, but more so than the representation and the sort of environment that it builds, it comes down to the point where the worlds, the communities, the spaces, whether that be on World of Warcraft or on Twitter or on Discord, have essentially been a place that is toxic and often untenable for Black existences in many cases. So a lot of what I do, or what I'm thinking through within my research as conducting a digital ethnography throughout the pandemic and after, is how are Black individuals creating the spaces that allow them to exist in gaming spaces? Why do they keep coming back? How do they form the friendships, the identity, the communities that are surviving within these problematic spaces? And how are they building up their communities? But during research, what I came to realize that while individuals were surely building communities in these very specific ways, a lot of it was often referred to in separate worlds, often in their differentiation between white space and Black space, and commenting that white space was a completely separate world from that of Black environments, and thus Black worlds must also create their own space. And this was a fascinating thing to come about. So I've started developing more theory and ideas around what does it really mean to create Black worlds, and what does it really mean to exist within these gaming spaces where many of these individuals have never met each other physically but are still finding community and family nonetheless. Now, this brings me to the main premise of Playing in Color, which is largely the idea of Black intermediality, or what I'm essentially referring to as world between worlds and the realms between realms, because essentially what Black individuals were doing when they were forming their communities and their spaces, or what they came to consider worlds, was that it wasn't just a Facebook group that was, Black Planet or Black Multiverse. It wasn't just a Twitter space. It wasn't just a Discord group that was existing, but rather it was a combination of these multiple spaces and games that they were using in order to exist. What the book is essentially trying to do is trying to understand and make sense of the fact that, of course, Blackness is not a monolith. It is not there's not one form of being Black, but rather the response to anti-Blackness and racism has been varied within the constructions of these worlds, and these worlds then allow for the idea or building of what is or isn't a safe space for Black individuals online.
Today I'll be chatting a bit about the research I've been doing surrounding Black users in social VR and avatars. For those unfamiliar, social VR is an emerging ecology of immersive virtual worlds where users can socialize with each other through head-mounted displays or HMDs. And unlike traditional desktop-only based virtual worlds, HMDs enable a novel form of avatar-mediated interaction where users' physical movements sync with their avatar's movements. Studying avatars, digital self-representation, as well as identity within this emerging context. That said, what's been lacking in this still emerging area of social VR research is, studying race and also the experiences and perspectives of Black users in these environments. In particular, to my knowledge, there's been little research on the multifaceted and intersectional experiences of Black users in social VR, how this high degree of immersion shapes racialized experiences of users, as well as just viewing social virtual reality as an emerging backdrop for Black digital praxis. Moreover, while previous research has uncovered how racial biases exist in traditional virtual worlds, less attention has been given to how biases manifest in this more immersive medium of social virtual reality. One of the first things that became immediately salient was this predominance of white and light-skinned avatars available on VR chat. There's this one quote by a participant that reads, "We do have many different types of avatars, species, styles, but you must keep in mind that there are more of these avatars than ones that represent Black or brown people." They felt that it was easier for them to be non-human than it was to be Black or brown in this virtual environment. However, the ability to customize an avatar's skin tone was infrequent, and from what I observed and from what my participants observed, it almost always defaulted to the white version of the avatar. Therefore, for users who are trying on new customizable avatars and preferred a darker skin tone, they'd have to go through the additional steps of opening a few menus to toggle the skin tone to change it. What it represents is, despite what their perspective was, they all had to kind of navigate this racial bias that existed on the platform. To sum up this theme, it really showcased some of the more conscious identity choices and considerations being made by Black participants, especially compared to some of the responses that I received from white and white passing participants who described this privilege of not having to think about the lack of racial diversity on the platform. And I tried to better understand how the consequences of the lack of diversity might be unique in VR. Some participants described feeling more immersed in their VR avatars compared to avatars in traditional games. And with this context, amidst some other interview responses, we found that avatar racial discrepancies can feel particularly salient in VR. Some takeaways from this first study were the following. First, we uncovered how racially biased avatar systems manifest in social VR, showing that inclusive representation goes beyond just diversifying the avatars available, but also that hierarchies and inconsistencies between avatars can reveal social exclusivities that exist within the system. Second, we saw that when avatar systems failed in providing racial diversity, users of color, Black users, can take on additional burdens working around the non-inclusive environment and also just working to fill in the gaps. And then finally, avatar discrepancies can feel salient in immersive VR and affect avatar embodiment. But in conclusion, while acknowledging that yes, progress has been made when it comes to avatar racial representation, racial disparities still do exist within these worlds and are evolving into new mediums. And I think it is important for the stakeholders within this just to take note of both the similar and unique ways that racial biases are expressed within these newer immersive contexts of both virtual reality and also augmented reality as well.
who I am. I am a sociologist, an interdisciplinary sociologist who studies language. I'm also a practice theorist and a big follower of the work of Pierre Bourdieu and a lot of post-millennial critical realists. I study masculinity and gender, and I particularly look at game culture. I don't study games. I don't even really study gamers. I study the culture in which games happen and gamers play. I look at gaming spaces and assumptions about them in a paper that's currently under review and about to come back to me, I think, in the next month or so, from a journal. I speculate 2 different topics, one being gaming doxa and gaming exceptionalism. Doxa is the unspoken, assumed concepts that are true about gamer space in general and the gamer specifically, born out of stereotypes and understandings of those who participate. So in looking at populations, I particularly am looking at nowadays African American men and talking about the idea of expectations, assertions, and how statistics affect that. 2 very important concepts. Ferguson's work, her book was called Bad Boys, and if you haven't read it, then shame on you. But she comes up with this conversation and topic, which is adultification. And adultification talks about this idea that particularly young Black men have this expectation that's put on them through the broader society that they are supposed to act better, be far more mature, be more significantly man-like than their contemporaries, their peers of other racial groups. Latino boys get the same issue, but the comparison that Ferguson says is this doesn't happen to white boys. And she points out the fact that if an issue is presented in the news and an African-American young man from the point of view of 12, 13, 14 does something, they're referred to as young men or men, whereas if it was someone who was white, it would be a young person or boy. What does authenticity look like? What does it mean to be authentically Black? What does it mean to be authentically anything? All of that plays into this interrelationship that I talk about in some of my newer work. And the idea of Black male exceptionalism that came from Butler. And Butler says there are these damning statistics about Black men, like 1 out of every 3 Black men under the age of 50 are incarcerated. Black men are the lowest population to finish the first year of college. And that these serve as controlling images and controlling ideas for African American men. So they have to live their life in collaboration and in defiance of this Black male exceptionalism, according to Butler. I came up with the idea of masculine gender capital. I didn't come up with gender capital, but I talked about the idea that there's specific gender capital that is valued when it's done in the embodied male form, and the elements of those embodied male form and how there are expectations about that. In a lot of my work, I talk about the idea of masculine gender capital. And then Anthony Neal's book, which is looking at the idea of realness. And realness really relates to this concept of authenticity and how that plays into the identity and the internalization of identity, specifically in African American men. So Black masculinity is then constructed and reified right beside white or generic American masculinity, Black femininity, and historical structures that define how we are supposed to read the Black male body. How does all of this play into gaming? Don't worry, I'm getting there. Lack of generational wealth and the presence of Black male exceptionalism requires the vast majority of Black men to be self-made men. So in other words, it's all about how are you going to be successful? How are you going to be able to provide? And there's a correlation between hard work, potential success, and the need for Black excellence. So this is in the back of minds in the creation and perpetuation of this idea of Black masculinity. There's a need for acceptance of subcultural related privilege, which is mostly based around white middle-class norms. Aaron Trammell's book talks about the whole idea of network of privilege and how it's built out of norms of white upper middle-class men. And then there's the idea of Black authenticity online and the role of verbal interplay, such as making fun of each other online. I'm on a couple of sites where this happens all the time. And the use of AAVE online. That's not necessarily about this presentation of self, because as Simon pointed out, there are some limitations on how individuals can present oneself in a game. So there are other ways in which showing one's Blackness and authenticity in gaming spaces that has to come out. And this is very evident, particularly in Black male gamers. So what are the implications? Black men particularly are under scrutiny from both the macro standpoint, so being Black men who are gaming, and the meso standpoint, which is being Black men who are gaming and part of the Black community. So much of the gaming capital and network of privilege surrounds the integration of whatever practices those are, which tend to be in their formation white, but are not Black. So it's about how do you mesh those together, but that puts a strain on authenticity. So in my dissertation about 3 years ago, I came up with this concept of constrained masculinity, not for this purpose, but hey, it serves. And it's about masculine performances caught between an intersection of expectations. And so the monograph that I'm going to be working on in the summer is going to be talking about this constrained masculinity, particularly among African-American men who engage in leisure. What are some avenues for research? Deeper understandings of Black masculinity, how Black men interpret constrained issues, code switching in the sense that it's talked about colloquially, because if I said code switching, it's code switching to sociolinguists, they would just explode, and how that relates to gaming spaces, what it means to be authentic in gaming spaces and what that looks like, particularly for African-American men, and the internal differences. Both of the previous speakers spoke about the idea that African-American community is not a monolith. So there are interfaces and differences from the point of view of class, from the point of view of education, from the point of view of identity that have to be investigated, even if we're talking about a subpopulation like African-American men.